Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm ffinlo Costain. Sir Dieter Helm is Professor of Economic Policy at the University of Oxford. From 2012 to 2020, he was the independent chair of the Natural Capital Committee, providing advice to the government on the sustainable use of natural capital. In the wake of the Housing Secretary's decision to end nutrient neutrality, Professor Sir Dieter Helm has said that it's all too easy for NGOs to criticise government, but that notwithstanding, a long-term solution is needed to address the problem of nutrient loading. I asked him why he thinks that NGOs have been too critical of the decision to end nutrient neutrality.
Well, I think the point that I was making is that the NGOs are very focused on the failures of the government, but they're absolutely silent on what's happening with regard to the opposition. And if you look at what Labour's doing, and in particular the proposals in respect to the Green Belt, I think the focus should be on the fact that most of our political class are not on site for the addressing our nature problems, natural capital, and so on. So it's both sides at fault here. And I think the RSPB liars comment is just politically inept and rude and doesn't help one iota towards addressing the substantive issues.
And of course, the RSPB have now apologised for that remark. Do you think that house building is the right target to stop additional nutrient loading in environmentally sensitive areas?
Whether or not house builders contribute a lot or a little, they are part of the problem. And if we're going to have houses, the critical question is what sort of houses in what sort of places. And if you're already in an environmentally sensitive area, there's probably lots of other issues at stake too, not just the nutrients question. So it's basically trying not to see this as a nutrient silo in respect of planning permission, but as a proper spatial planning issue in respect of where we're going to put not just the houses, but the trees, the protected environments, and especially how we're going to enhance the green belt rather than trash it even further than it has been.
Before we go into some of the detail on that, this change in the law effectively pulls the rug out from under the nitrogen credit marketplace. Now, surely, and this is something that you've advocated yourself in the past, a market-led response is an important tool for maintaining Britain's natural capital.
So we have to sort out the various components of this. So is it right that polluters should pay? Yes, of course it is. Right. And if you're going to put extra nutrient load into a river or catchment, a particular place, should you compensate for the damage you're doing if it works as part of the spatial planning of the area? Yes, of course you should. But that's not the same as saying, you know, I've got this particular site to build 150 houses. It's nutrient sensitive. So I've got this other site down the road, which I'm going to rewild or whatever. It's not necessarily the case that because you have a polluter payment to be made, that the right thing to do is have the polluter bargain with individual landowners. Just as it's important to put the houses in the right places, it's important to put the offsetting, the compensation in the right places. So I would have, yes, paying for the pollution you're causing, but I wouldn't have it on a case-by-case basis, bottom up. I'd have it catchment based, and the money that's raised from the costs of the pollution should go to putting the right mitigation in the right places, not what a particular landowner or a particular builder happens to find attractive.
So let's go into that in a bit more detail. Now, you said that the proposed amendment to the Levelling Up Bill is a short-term fix. Why is it a short-term fix? And what does a long-term solution look like?
Well, if you look at the state of our rivers, and you know, some are worse than others. But if you take the Wye, for example, as a catastrophic wrecking of natural capital, okay, it's pretty obvious that simply going for solutions which involve, let's be blunt, having bigger tanks all over the place is hardly a long-term sustainable way of addressing the problems of our rivers and getting them back to a decent state. So what you have to do is start the other way around with pollution at source. Right? And that's one of the reasons why this nutrient issue with regard to housing is important. Okay, so if we look at a catchment as a whole and ask ourselves, what are the main pollutants in catchments? Who's responsible for them? And frankly, what's the cheapest way of getting that pollution down? You rapidly discover that it's utterly pointless to focus on particular end of pipeline solutions, when what you can actually do is go upstream and stop the pollutants getting there in the first place. So on the why, you know, we can argue weasel words about precisely how it's measured and all those bits and pieces, but everybody knows that the poultry farms in the upper Y have contributed to a catastrophe. Of course, other people have contributed as well, but you need to think about, in that catchment, A, why were the poultry farms allowed to be there, near the river, in the upper catchment? I mean, it's a ludicrous idea, given the costs that they're imposing on the rest of us and the damage to natural capital as a whole. There were much better places to put the poultry farms.
Why were they allowed? Why do you think they were allowed?
Oh, because the way we've gone about our natural environment, and it's a long historical background, is that if you own land, basically you have the right to do what you like with it, unless someone comes in and imposes restrictions from on top. And let's face it, the farmers, perfectly understandably, have been fantastically good at lobbying for their own self-interest. Okay, so it's not that the person wanting to put the poultry farm in a particular location has to think, how do I do that in a catchment basis? And is that okay from a catchment point of view? They start with, it's my right to put it there. You try and stop me. Then we have to invent ex post rules to deal with the problem. And in the process of doing that, we have to prove the problem. Well, by the time you proved it, the Y is green. It's too late. And I think that's because we never, ever in this country have got serious about some spatial planning. And in a small and crowded island where we want to build lots of houses and we want decent natural capital, we want the right trees in the right place, we want the right mitigation in the right place, and we want to reduce the pollution at source. And also we want to sort out the flooding at source too. And that's the opposite of what we're currently doing, which is bottom up and incredibly costly and inefficient.
Is part of the problem that you've got different planning decisions being taken by different planning authorities, but they're not communicating with each other effectively?
Well, that may be part of the issue, but what's missing is a Y integrated catchment system plan and a proper institution to ensure that plan is delivered. And that's where I advocate catchment system regulation, catchment system planning, and catchment system operators. I mean, and it's not rocket science. We've realized in energy we have to do that. That's why we're having a future system operator to do precisely this job. And I think it should be done for the railways and for transport. And that was part of the new transport proposals, which have got lost. And by the way, I think it should be done for broadband as well. So you have to have a framework. Now, it's very, in my world, market orientated and is driven by incentives. So the plan for the catchment comes up with the outputs required consistent with the Environment Act. And then it's an open website. You come up with ideas as to how you might do it. You come up with the costs that you might have. And let's find out whether the water companies are best to do this, or that the farmers, all sorts of other players might come into the fray. And I'll give you a quick example. Okay, so if you take Oxford, we're having a canal built around Oxford at what, 200 million or something, to reduce the flood risk in Botley, where, by the way, the houses should never have been built in the first place. But never mind, they're there. Okay, did anyone think whether it would be better and cheaper to hold the floodwaters upstream, to pay landowners, get wildlife trusts, etc., involved in managing to hold water before it ends up in Botley? It's a sort of cameo of, why don't we hold the water before it ends up in the sewer? It's a bit late by that stage. And so there's huge economic opportunities here to do this much cheaper. And frankly, customers can't afford to pay for all those tanks that we're going to have littered around the countryside at sewage works.
Now, why do you think a catchment system regulator, which is effectively what we're talking about here, why do you think that would succeed where the current network of regulators has failed?
Well, I could flippantly remark that it's virtually impossible to make it worse than it currently is. Everybody's in a silo. We're going to discover in October just how big the water bills are going to be for all these tanks that we're going to have. The EA and the Ofwat have often in the past been at loggerheads, and the farming and the ELM schemes are all done separately. So you couldn't make it worse. But actually, I'm much more ambitious than that and much more optimistic about what we can do. I think because we cannot afford what's currently being proposed, or by which I mean that the voters and the consumers won't pay, we have to find cheaper ways of doing this. And an integrated approach is the right way of doing it. We don't need Ofwat. We do need the Environment Agency to be a proper environmental protection agency. They shouldn't and don't need to be doing floods. And we do need to open this up to lots of other players who can contribute to better solutions. But in the end, it depends on the statutory basis for the catchment system regulatory model I have in mind. I think it's pretty straightforward. I think we're learning in the electricity sector how to do this. It's not rocket science. It's pretty straightforward. And frankly, I think we cannot afford not to do this. We can't go on like this. And I don't think, as has been demonstrated this year, and the media, the press, the politicians, etc., I don't think we can stand what we're doing much longer.
Now, just finally, we talked about the Conservative government and about the Labour Party's policy at the start of this interview. Do you think that there is political capital to be earned in the run-up to the next election by taking the environment, by taking natural capital more seriously?
Well, you'd like to think so, but there's no evidence that that's what's happening. And both parties are committed to maximising GDP growth. Both parties are committed to maximising house building. And if you look at both the energy and the environment policies of Labour and the Conservative, I think it's very hard, once you've got rid of the rhetoric, to get a piece of paper between them. And an example I would give is the offshore oil and gas, right? You know, for Labour, it's very convenient. The Conservatives approve all these licenses, and then they can say, oh, we didn't agree with those, but we're not going to interfere with them once they're in place, and they can have the benefits of the oil and gas output that comes. You know, I may be getting cynical as I watch this space, but, you know, I don't see either of the major parties fighting to do what's good and best for the natural environment. And the sad thing about it is that either of them seem to have the bandwidth to realize that it would be cheaper to do it properly. And what I fear, and I think it's pretty much inevitable, that we're going to have more of the same. The river issues and the water supply issues will get worse, not better. And I think the consequence will be there'll be a bigger crisis down the road than there currently is. But trying to tell politicians that you may have a crisis in 3-4 years' time and get them to do something about it right now, that proves a very, very difficult wicket. This is a disappointing development over the nutrients. It's an opportunity, though, to get it right. And I hear a deafening silence from Labour on what they would actually do about Thames Water, what they'd actually do about the nutrients, and what they'd actually do about integrating the catchments, and what they'd actually do to make polluters pay within our catchment landscape.
That was Professor Sir Dieter Helm from the University of Oxford. More about this and our other headline news on our website, 8point9.com. That's all for now. We're back later this week. Thanks for watching.